Lebanon was nothing like the ancient city it was named after. Nothing biblical or historical, just a small town in Tennessee where life flowed slowly like syrup on the rim of a jar on a hot summer day. Streets with neat little houses, small stores, a church in the center square, and that special feeling when everyone knew a little more about each other than they would have liked. On the east side of town, where the houses were getting smaller and the yards unkept, lived Chanel Gaines, a woman of 52 whose life was scheduled by the hour between two jobs. She worked mornings and afternoons as a maid at the Bluebird Motel on the outskirts of town and evenings as a part-time janitor at the local hospital. Her hands, once smooth and well-groomed, were now covered with calluses and cracks from constant contact with cleaning products. But Chanel didn't complain. All for Nia, her only daughter, only. Nia Gaines, at 24, was already working as a nurse at the Lebanon Clinic. She had inherited her mother's high cheekbones and expressive eyes, but she held herself differently, a straight back, a proud chin, determination and purpose in every movement. Nia was the kind of person who wasn't going to be stuck in a small town forever. She had plans to finish medical school, become a registered nurse, and then possibly a doctor. That Sunday morning, Nia sat at the kitchen table in the tiny apartment she rented with her mother, poring over samples of wedding invitations. Her fiancé, Quentin Brooks, sat across the table watching her with a quiet smile. "What do you think of this one?" Nia held out a gold-rimmed sample to him. Quentin, a young man of 24 with broad shoulders and calloused welder's hands, took the card as if it were made of the finest porcelain. "Beautiful," he said, though his eyes told him that he saw no difference between this sample and the previous 20. "Do you like this one?" Nia rolled her eyes, but smiled. Quentin wasn't good at this sort of thing, but he supported her, and that was the main thing. They'd met 3 years ago at a barbecue at a mutual friend's house. Quentin worked as a welder at a small metal fabrication shop, was reliable, calm, and which Nia especially appreciated, had ambition. He dreamed of one day opening his own workshop. "I still think we could save money and make the invitations ourselves," Quentin said, carefully returning the sample. "It's our wedding," Nia objected. "A once-in-a-lifetime one, unless you're planning something I don't know about." She squinted playfully. Quentin raised his hands in feigned surrender. "You know you're the only woman in my life." At that moment, the front door opened, and Chanel appeared on the doorstep, tired after her night shift at the hospital. Her janitor's uniform was spotlessly clean, but her shoulders slumped with fatigue. "Good morning, youngsters." She tried to smile, but it didn't come out very convincingly. "Mom, you need to rest." Nia stood up to help her mother with her bag. "How many hours have you been awake?" "I haven't counted." Chanel waved her hand. "How are the wedding plans going?" "Trying to convince your daughter that you don't have to spend half the budget on invitations that people will throw away in 5 minutes?" Quentin said, winking at Chanel. "And I'm trying to explain to my future husband that first impressions matter," Nia parried. "Mom, are you hungry? I can make an omelet." Chanel shook her head. "I just want to shower and go to bed. I have a shift at the motel at 4. Nia frowned. "Mom, you're working too much. That can't be healthy." "I'm fine, honey. Not everyone can afford health insurance. Besides," she glanced at the sample invitations, "we have a lot of expenses ahead of us." "We could postpone the wedding," Quentin interjected. "Or we could do something more modest." "Don't even think about it," Chanel said firmly. "You deserve a real celebration." Before anyone could object, Quentin's phone rang. He looked at the screen and frowned. "I have to take this. It's from work." He walked out onto the tiny balcony, leaving Nia and Chanel alone. "He's a good guy," Chanel said quietly, looking at Quentin through the window. "You made the right choice." Nia followed her gaze and smiled. "I know, he's reliable." Chanel gave her daughter a sudden hug. "I'm so proud of you, you know? You're going to accomplish everything I could ever dream of." "Mom," Nia felt a lump in her throat. "You sound like you're saying goodbye." "I'm just tired." Chanel let go of her daughter and headed for the bathroom. "Wake me up at 3, okay?" Nia looked after her mother, feeling vaguely uneasy. Chanel seemed different lately, more thoughtful, sometimes distant. Nia put it down to fatigue, but something told her it was more than that. 3 days later, on Tuesday, Nia finished her shift at the clinic earlier than usual. She decided to stop by her mother's house to pick up her old anatomy textbooks. Quentin had recently expressed an interest in how the human body worked, and Nia thought that was a good sign. Perhaps he could be persuaded to go to medical school to get a more prestigious profession. As she pulled up to the house, she spotted Quentin's familiar pickup truck in the driveway. Strange. He was supposed to be at work. Maybe he'd decided to stop by Chanel's house to help with something around the house? He did that a lot, fixing leaky faucets, changing light bulbs, doing minor repairs. Nia smiled, another reason why she loved him. She entered the house quietly, intending to surprise him, but froze in the hallway when she heard strange noises coming from her mother's bedroom. Nia's heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't. As if in a dream, she moved slowly toward the ajar bedroom door. What she saw changed her life forever. Chanel and Quentin, on the bed, her mother and her fiancé. Nia couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin around her. As if in slow motion, she saw Quentin kissing her mother's neck, Chanel running her fingers through his hair, them whispering something to each other that Nia couldn't hear, thankfully. She stepped back, trying not to make a sound. Something inside her broke, shattered into 1,000 shards. One thought throbbed in her head: her mother and Quentin, betrayal on both sides, a double betrayal that shattered everything she believed in. Nia walked silently out of the house and got into the car. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just sat there, staring at nothing while something dark and cold flared inside her. The next morning, Nia showed up for work as usual. She smiled at her coworkers, took care of patients, even joked with Dr. Pearson about his new tie. No one noticed that her smile didn't reach her eyes, that a hollowness had settled in them. In the evening, she met Quentin at their favorite cafe. He talked about his day, his problems at work, his plans for the weekend. She nodded, asked questions, held his hand across the table. The perfect bride, loving and attentive. It wasn't until late at night, alone, that Nia allowed herself to feel the full pain of betrayal. She didn't cry. It was too cold inside for tears. Instead, she opened her laptop and began searching for information. About poisons, about suicide notes, about how to stage a suicide. 4 days later, Kenyatta Dumont, Chanel's best friend and motel co-worker, became concerned when she didn't show up for work or answer her phone. This was totally unlike the punctual Chanel. Kenyatta stopped by her house after her shift and found the door unlocked. "Chanel?" she called out as she entered the quiet house. "Are you here, friend?" There was no response. Kenyatta walked through the living room, noting the perfect order, typical Chanel, and peeked into the kitchen. No one. "Chanel?" She headed toward the bedroom, feeling a growing unease. She found her friend in bed. Chanel looked almost peaceful, as if she were asleep, but her skin was cold, and next to her on the bedside table was an empty vial of sleeping pills and a note. Kenyatta's scream broke the silence of the house. Less than an hour later, Chanel Gaines' house was surrounded by police cars. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering and speculating. Quentin rushed over as soon as he heard the news, his face pale with shock. Nia was the last to arrive, her eyes wide but dry. Detective Eldridge Mason arrived as the medical examiner was already finishing his preliminary examination of the body. Mason was a tall man of 43 with a short haircut and attentive eyes that seemed to notice everything. He wore inexpensive but neat suits and had a reputation for not backing down until he got to the truth. "What have we here?" he asked the young officer who met him at the door. "Chanel Gaines, 52 years old, presumed suicide," the officer reported. "Found by a friend this evening. Empty sleeping pill bottle and a note next to it." Mason nodded and went into the bedroom. He examined the body carefully without touching it, then shifted his gaze to the note, which had already been placed in a clear evidence bag. "I'm sorry, Nia. I couldn't live with what I did. I don't deserve your love. Please find the strength to forgive us someday. Mom." Mason frowned, studying the handwriting. The note looked genuine, but something about the overall pattern bothered him. He turned to the medical examiner. "Time of death? Preliminarily, between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. rigor mortis is consistent with about 18 hours from the time of death." Mason nodded and went out into the living room where the officers were interviewing Kenyatta, Quentin, and Nia. Miss Gaines, he walked over to Nia, who sat motionless on the couch, her face a mask of calm. Please accept my condolences. I'm Detective Mason. May I ask you a few questions? Nia looked up at him. Of course, Detective. When was the last time you saw your mother? The morning before yesterday. Her voice was steady. I stopped by before work to drop off her blood pressure medicine. She was complaining of headaches. Did she seem depressed or worried about something? Nia thought for a moment. No more than usual. Mom was always working hard and tired, but she wasn't... Her voice trembled slightly. She wasn't suicidal. Mason nodded, making notes in his notebook. And you, Mr. Brooks? When was the last time you saw Miss Gaines? Quentin, who was sitting next to Nia, visibly tensed. 3 days ago, I think. I stopped by to fix the kitchen sink. 3 days ago? Mason interjected, looking down at his notes. What time was that? In the afternoon, around 3, Quentin answered too quickly. I was on my lunch break. Mason made another note and turned to Kenyatta, who was crying quietly in the corner. Miss Dumont, I understand you were a close friend of the deceased? Kenyatta nodded, wiping away her tears. We worked together at the motel for over a decade. Chanel was my best friend. Had she talked about any problems lately? Anything that might explain... this? Kenyatta shook her head. No, on the contrary. The last few weeks, she seemed happier than usual, more animated. I thought it was because of Nia's upcoming wedding. Mason noticed Nia and Quentin exchange quick glances. Something wasn't adding up here. He looked around the room once more, noting the perfect order, the lack of signs of struggle or intrusion. Everything pointed to suicide, and yet something was wrong. Mason felt it instinctively, the way an experienced hunter senses the presence of game in the woods even if he can't see it. We'll continue our investigation, he said finally. Please be available for further questions. As he left the house, he noticed Quentin put his arm around Nia's shoulders. She didn't pull away, but she didn't snuggle up to him either, as one might expect of a bride seeking comfort. Her back remained straight, and her gaze remained blank. Mason got into the car and went over his notes one more time. At first glance, everything pointed to suicide, the suicide note, the lack of signs of struggle, the manner of death. But over the years, he'd learned to trust his gut, and it was now screaming that something was seriously wrong with this case. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed the forensic lab. I want a full toxicology and handwriting analysis on the Gaines case, he said, and I want it done as soon as possible. Rain drummed on the umbrellas of mourners gathered at Hillside Cemetery in Lebanon. The sky, covered in heavy gray clouds, seemed to mourn Chanel Gaines along with everyone else. A small group of people, mostly colleagues from the motel and hospital, a few neighbors and distant relatives, stood in a semicircle around the freshly dug grave. Nia Gaines stood straight, like a soldier on duty. Her black dress emphasized her slender figure, and her face was frozen in an expression that was hard to read, a mixture of grief and some strange, detached calmness. Next to her, holding an umbrella over her head, stood Quentin Brooks. Unlike his bride, he looked frankly bad, pale, with eyes red from lack of sleep and a nervously twitching corner of his mouth. The pastor, a middle-aged man with a kind face, spoke of mercy and forgiveness, that it is not for us to judge those who choose to leave early. Kenyatta Dumont, standing on the other side of Nia, did not hide her tears. She held her tear-wet handkerchief to her face and sobbed quietly. Behind the small crowd, a little to the side, stood Detective Eldridge Mason. He wasn't dressed in black. He was wearing the same inexpensive gray suit he usually wore, but his presence here was no accident. He was watching, at Nia, at Quentin, at their interactions, at who approached them with condolences and how they reacted. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, the pastor said, and the first handful of earth fell on the coffin lid with a thud that seemed to echo with pain in the hearts of those present. Kenyatta burst into full-blown tears. Nia put one arm around her, but her own eyes remained dry. Quentin stood nearby, shuffling from foot to foot, his gaze roving strangely over the faces of those gathered, as if he was afraid to linger on something. After the ceremony, people began to disperse. Some went to their cars, others to the small church hall, where a modest wake had been organized. Mason moved leisurely in the same direction, continuing to watch. The church hall was warm and dry. Women from the local congregation had set up tables, sandwiches, salads, casseroles, the usual food for such sad events. Nia sat at the table, accepting condolences and mechanically thanking everyone. Quentin stood against the wall, nervously rubbing the cup of coffee he never drank. Mason walked over to Kenyatta, who sat in the corner, still wiping her tears. "Miss Dumont," he said quietly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Kenyatta looked at him with reddened eyes. "Of course, detective." Her voice was hoarse from crying. They stepped out into a small hallway where it was quieter. "I know this isn't the best time," Mason began, "but I'd like to ask you a few more questions about Chanel." Kenyatta nodded, clutching a wet handkerchief in her hands. "You said she seemed happier than usual lately," Mason continued. "Could you elaborate? Any particular changes in her behavior, habits?" Kenyatta thought for a moment. "She's taken more care of herself," she said at last. "She bought a new dress, though she usually spent money only on Nia. Sometimes I'd catch her in front of the mirror. She looked younger, you know, and she'd check her phone a lot, smiling at the messages." "Do you think she might have been having an affair?" Mason asked me directly. Kenyatta looked confused. "I don't know. Maybe. She didn't say anything, but—" She hesitated. "In the last couple months, she'd really been kind of elated. Like a girl in love, you know?" Mason nodded, making a mental note. "What about the depression? Did you ever notice any signs of suicidal thoughts in her? Maybe she talked about being tired of life, or that everything was meaningless." Kenyatta shook her head decisively. "Never. Chanel was a strong woman, detective. She raised Nia alone, worked 2 jobs, and I never heard her complain. She always said she was doing everything for her daughter so she could get out of Lebanon and build a better life." "And in her last days before she died, did you notice any change in her mood?" "The last time I saw her, it was 2 days before. That day, she was in a great mood. We were discussing Nia's wedding, and she was showing me samples of dresses she and her daughter were looking at. Chanel was so excited for Nia. She said Quentin was exactly the right man for her daughter. At the mention of Quentin, Mason shifted his gaze to the hall where he was still standing against the wall, now in conversation with some older man. Quentin looked tense, his shoulders raised as if in anticipation of a punch. "Thank you, Miss Dumont," Mason said. "You've been very helpful." He left Kenyatta and walked leisurely through the room, stopping here and there, pretending to study the photographs of Chanel arranged on a small table. One of them showed her with Nia, both smiling at the camera, their resemblance obvious despite their age difference. Another showed Chanel standing at the entrance to the Bluebird Motel in her work uniform. In the third, an older one, she was holding little Nia, just a baby. Mason discreetly watched Quentin, who was now standing alone, nervously checking something on his cell phone. The detective slowly approached him. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly. Quentin flinched and hastily tucked the phone into his pocket. "Detective." He tried to smile, but it didn't come out very convincingly. "Tough day," Mason said, as if making small talk. "Yeah," Quentin nodded, his gaze wandering around the room again. "Nia's holding up better than I thought she would." "She's strong like her mother," Mason said, watching his companion's reaction carefully. Quentin swallowed and nodded. "Yes, they look alike." "Mr. Brooks," Mason lowered his voice slightly, "I would like to ask you a few more questions about your last visit to Chanel." Quentin's face became visibly tense. "I've already told you everything I remember. I stopped by to fix the sink, and that was 3 days ago, about 3 o'clock. "And you never saw her again?" "No." The answer came too quickly. "Did you talk to her? On the phone, maybe?" Quentin hesitated for a moment. "Yes, I think we corresponded. Something about the wedding, I don't remember exactly." Mason nodded, as if it were a perfectly natural answer. "Would you allow me to look at your correspondence?" "What?" Quentin looked like he'd been slapped. "Why?" "It's standard procedure, Mr. Brooks. We check all communications in the last days before death." "Yeah, Quentin licked his dry lips. I think I deleted the messages. Yeah, I clean up my history a lot. I understand, Mason said calmly. Don't worry, we can restore them if we need to. He noticed Quentin go pale, but before he could respond, Nia came up to them. Hello, detective. Her voice was steady. Are you here for work or have you come to pay your respects? Mason turned to her. Both, Miss Gaines. I'm sorry for your loss again. Thank you. She shifted her gaze to Quentin. Are you all right? You look pale. Yeah. Quentin swallowed nervously. I need some air. I'm sorry. He walked quickly out of the hall, leaving Nia and Mason alone. He's having a hard time, Nia said, looking after her fiancé. He loved his mom very much. Mason looked at her carefully, trying to catch any hint of irony or bitterness in her words, but Nia's face remained impenetrable. Miss Gaines, he began, I know this isn't the best time, but I have to ask, were you aware of any problems in your mother's life? Something that might explain her decision? Nia shook her head. No, detective. Like I said, Mom wasn't prone to depression or suicide. The only thing she always worried about was making sure I had everything I needed. She didn't mention any, personal relationship? With a man, perhaps? Nia tensed slightly, but it only lasted a moment. No, she was too busy working. She didn't have time for a personal life. Mason nodded, not showing that he noticed this momentary change in her posture. I see. Well, I won't keep you from your guests any longer. If you think of anything that might help with the investigation, please contact me. Investigation? Nia interjected. I thought it was a suicide. We have to check all possibilities, Mason replied evasively. It's standard procedure. Nia nodded, and something flashed in her eyes. Concern, anxiety, but it disappeared immediately. Of course, detective. I want you to find the truth, whatever it is. Mason stayed at the wake for a while longer, talking to others present, gathering bits and pieces of information about Chanel Gaines's life. A picture was emerging of a hardworking, devoted mother who had recently begun to show signs of some new happiness in her life. This did not at all look like the portrait of someone ready to end her life. Back at the station, Mason's first order of business was to see if there was any news from the lab on the Gaines case. To his surprise, the preliminary results of the handwriting examination were ready. He opened the folder and scrutinized the report. The expert noted several discrepancies between Chanel's handwriting samples taken from her personal records and documents and the handwriting in the suicide note. Despite the general similarities, the note showed a strange tension in the lines, uncharacteristic of Chanel's usual handwriting. In addition, some of the letters were written differently than she usually wrote. The conclusion was cautious but unequivocal. The note had probably been forged by someone who knew Chanel's handwriting well and could imitate it, but who still could not perfectly reproduce all the features. Mason leaned back in his chair, pondering this information. If the note had been forged, then it wasn't a suicide. It was a murder disguised as a suicide. He went over his notes from the crime scene and the funeral again. Quentin Brooks was nervous, confused about his answers, deleted messages from Chanel's phone. He looked guilty, but was he really guilty of murder? Mason remembered Kenyatta talking about Chanel's recent happiness, how it was like she was younger, checking her phone often, smiling at the messages. It sounded like a description of a woman who was having an affair. And who could her partner be if not her daughter's young fiancé? That gave Quentin a motive for murder. If Chanel threatened to tell Nia about their relationship, it could ruin his upcoming marriage. Or perhaps he was trying to end that relationship and Chanel didn't want to let him go. But something was still bothering Mason. Nia, her strange calmness at the funeral, her reticence, her momentary tension when he'd asked about her mother's possible relationship. Had she known? And if so, what exactly? Mason decided to check one more detail. He called the lab. This is Detective Mason, on the Gaines case. Did you check the fingerprints on the sleeping pill vial? Yes, sir, the technician answered. The victim's prints are clear, as expected. And on the pills themselves? Mason asked. On the pills? The technician sounded surprised. We don't usually check. Check, Mason interrupted him. One more thing, I need to know if anyone else's prints were on the note besides the victim. You got it, detective. I'll let you know as soon as I get the results. Mason hung up the phone and stared at Chanel Gaines's picture in the file. A middle-aged woman with a tired but kind face looked into the camera with a slight smile. What happened to you, Chanel? Who took your life? And why? His musings were interrupted by the phone ringing. "Detective Mason," he answered. "Detective, it's Morris in toxicology. I have the preliminary results on the Gaines case. I'm listening. The victim did indeed have high levels of sleeping pills in his blood, consistent with an overdose, but there's something else interesting. We also found traces of a strong sedative, which is not part of the pills we found." Mason straightened up in his chair. "Are you saying she was given 2 different drugs?" "It would appear so. And the first one, the sedative, could have taken away her ability to resist before she was given a lethal dose of sleeping pills. It's definitely not suicide," Mason muttered. "Excuse me?" "It's all right. Thanks for the information, Morris. Keep me posted if you find anything else." He hung up the phone and tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. So, Chanel Gaines was murdered. Someone slipped her a sedative, and then, when she was in a helpless state, forced her to swallow a lethal dose of sleeping pills and left a fake suicide note. Given the lack of signs of forced entry and struggle, it had to be someone she knew and trusted. Someone who could have entered her home, made her a drink or a meal with a spiked sedative. Quentin Brooks fit that description, and he had a motive, assuming he was having an affair with Chanel that he wanted to end before marrying Nia. Mason decided it was time to talk to Quentin in more detail. He picked up his cell phone and dialed the number. "Mr. Brooks, this is Detective Mason. I need you to come down to the station for an interview. Yeah, today, if possible. It's about the Chanel Gaines case. We've received some new information." Hanging up the phone, Mason leaned back in his chair and looked thoughtfully at the case notes board. He hadn't mentioned to Quentin exactly what information they'd gotten. Sometimes the best way to get to the truth was to make the suspect nervous, wondering exactly what the police knew. And judging by Quentin's reaction at the funeral, he had plenty to be nervous about. The only question was this guilt about having an affair with his fiancé's mother, or about killing her? Mason looked at the picture of Chanel again. Something still didn't add up in this story. Some piece of the puzzle was eluding him, and he felt that piece might be connected to Nia Gaines, whose calmness at her mother's funeral had been too perfect, too controlled for someone who had just lost her only parent. But so far he had no evidence against her, only a vague sense that she knew more than she was saying. With Quentin, on the other hand, there was both motive and opportunity, and clear signs of nervousness and guilt. Mason stood up and headed for the interrogation room. Quentin Brooks was due to arrive within the hour, and the detective wanted to be ready. This interview could be crucial to solving the Chanel Gaines murder case. Quentin Brooks' interrogation brought Detective Mason more questions than answers. The young welder was scared, nervous, confused about his movements on the day of Chanel's death, but categorically denied involvement in her murder. Mason couldn't charge him, not enough hard evidence yet, but intuition told the detective that Quentin was hiding something. The day after the interrogation, Mason decided to talk to Chanel's neighbors. The neighborhood where she lived was quiet. The houses stood close together. The people here usually knew more about what was happening on their street than they wanted to admit. The first person he visited was an elderly woman, Mrs. Wilkins, who lived in the house across the street. The gray-haired old lady with attentive eyes offered him iced tea and made herself comfortable in a rocking chair on the porch. "Chanel was a good neighbor," she said, rocking slowly. "Quiet, polite, always said hello, sometimes brought me pie. Her daughter's a nice girl too, but more reserved. You know how young people are these days, always in a hurry, always on their phones." "Did you often see Chanel have guests over?" Mason asked. Mrs. Wilkins looked thoughtfully into the distance. "Not particularly. Her daughter stopped by regularly, of course. And this young man, the groom, would show up occasionally. Usually he was fixing something around the house. Chanel always said how handy he was. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Maybe some change in Chanel's behavior?" The old lady took a sip of tea, as if buying time to think. "You know, now that you ask. Yes, there was something. About 2 months ago, Chanel seemed to blossom. She started taking better care of herself, even bought a new dress. I also thought maybe she got a man. At her age, that would be nice. She deserved a little happiness. Have you seen anyone who could be that man?" "No, I haven't seen anyone new. Just her daughter and her daughter's fiancé." Mason noticed something in Mrs. Wilkins's tone. But the old lady hesitated. I don't want to spread gossip, detective, especially now that poor Chanel's... Mrs. Wilkins, this could be important to the investigation. She sighed. Good. I noticed that this guy, Quentin, started coming to Chanel's house when Nia wasn't home, sometimes during the day when she was at work. I thought maybe they were planning some kind of wedding surprise for Nia, but I saw them standing on the porch one day and he kissed her. Not the way you kiss the mother of the bride. You know what I mean? Mason nodded. That confirmed his suspicions about the relationship between Chanel and Quentin. And Nia? Have you noticed if her behavior has changed lately? I can't say for sure. She's always been reserved, but, Mrs. Wilkins hesitated again. Did she? That day, the day Chanel was found, I saw Nia outside my mom's house. It was about 6 p.m., and she came in her car, but she didn't go in right away. She sat there for a while, as if she was getting her wits about her. Then she came in. She was there for maybe an hour. When she left, she looked, strange, calm. Too calm for someone who'd just visited her mother. Mason felt a chill run down his spine. 6 p.m. About the time the ME said Chanel might still be alive. Are you sure about that, Mrs. Wilkins? It was on the exact day Chanel died? The old lady nodded. Absolutely. The next morning I saw police cars outside her house. A terrible tragedy. After thanking Mrs. Wilkins, Mason went around to a few more neighbors. Most of them confirmed that Chanel seemed happier than usual lately. One man who lived 2 houses away also confirmed that he had seen Nia's car outside his mother's house on the evening of the day of her death. Mason's next stop was the Bluebird Motel, where Chanel worked. The manager, a full-figured, middle-aged man, said Chanel was a model employee, never late, always performing her duties conscientiously. For the past month, she has been asking to reschedule some shifts, he added. That never happened before. She always took any part-time job. Did she explain why? No, but I heard her on the phone during her breaks, laughing like a young girl. I thought maybe she had a man. Mason also met Kenyatta Dumont, who worked at the motel with Chanel. Still heartbroken, she confirmed that her friend had been unusually happy lately. We had lunch together almost every day, Kenyatta said. The week before what happened, Chanel got a text message on her phone and literally glowed. I asked who it was from, but she just smiled enigmatically and said that sometimes life surprises you when you're not expecting it. I thought she was having an affair and was happy for her. Chanel had devoted her whole life to her daughter. She deserved a little happiness for herself. Did she ever mention Quentin Brooks in that context? Kenyatta frowned. Nia's fiancé? No, of course not. She had only spoken of him as her daughter's future husband. Chanel had been very excited about the marriage, saying Quentin was a good, reliable guy. What about Nia? Have you noticed any changes in her behavior lately? Kenyatta thought for a moment. She had started to visit her mother less often. Chanel said Nia was very busy with work and wedding preparations, but the last time I saw them together, it was 10 days before Chanel's death. There seemed to be some tension between them. Nia was, colder than usual. I thought maybe they were arguing over some wedding plans. Mason thanked Kenyatta and went to the hospital where Chanel worked part-time and where Nia worked. He talked to several of the young woman's co-workers. They all described Nia as professional, reserved, and focused on her career. No one had noticed much change in her behavior in recent weeks, although one nurse recalled a strange incident. It was about a week before her mother died, she said. Nia is usually very calm, always keeping her emotions under control. But that day I caught her in the break room. She was sitting still, staring off into space, and I swear there was this cold rage in her eyes. Cold rage in her eyes. I asked if everything was okay, and it was like she woke up, smiled, and said she was just tired. But that smile didn't reach her eyes. After gathering all these statements, Mason went back to the station to mull over the information he'd gotten. All the evidence pointed to Chanel having an affair with her daughter's fiancé. And apparently, Nia had found out about it about a week before her mother's death. That gave her motive. Mason went over the forensic results again. The sleeping pills found in Chanel's blood were a strong prescription drug. Mason called the hospital and asked to see if such a drug was available to Nia as a nurse. The answer came an hour later. Yes, Nia had access to the medicine cabinet where the drug was stored. That left the question of the forged suicide note. If Nia really did kill her mother, how could she so skillfully forge her handwriting? Mason got a warrant to search Nia's apartment. He had to find something that would link her to her mother's death, evidence that would make his suspicions irrefutable. Nia's apartment was small, but neat and functional. Mason methodically searched every corner, every drawer. In the bedroom, in the bottom drawer of the dresser, under a stack of neatly folded clothes, he found a small box. Inside was a diary in a worn leather cover. Mason opened it and immediately realized he'd found what he was looking for. In the pages of the diary, Nia practiced writing various phrases in a handwriting that mimicked her mother's. The final pages contained several variations of a suicide note, almost identical to the one found next to Chanel's body. Next to the diary in the box was an empty vial of sleeping pills with a hospital label and several photographs. Mason examined them carefully. One was of Chanel and Quentin. They were standing very close together, and the look they were exchanging left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Another photograph showed them kissing on the porch of Chanel's house. The third was taken through a bedroom window and showed them in bed. Mason carefully put everything back in the box and called the officers to seize it as evidence. He now had enough evidence to arrest Nia Gaines on suspicion of her mother's murder. Nia was found at the hospital, in the middle of her shift. She calmly listened to her rights, asked for a few minutes to hand her patients over to another nurse, and followed the officers without resistance. In the interrogation room, she sat with a straight back, arms folded on the table. No sign of nervousness, no fear, just calm anticipation. Mason entered and sat down across from her. Between them, he placed the journal and photographs. "Miss Gaines," he began, "we found these in your apartment. Nia didn't even look at the evidence." "I know," she said. "Do you realize that this proves your involvement in your mother's death?" Nia nodded slowly. "Do you want to make a statement?" She finally shifted her gaze to the photographs. "I loved her," she said quietly. "All my life I've admired her, the way she sacrificed herself for me. How hard she worked to give me an education, opportunities she never had." Nia raised her eyes to Mason. "Do you know what she said when I announced my engagement?" She said, "You're finally going to get the happiness you deserve." Mason was silent, giving her a chance to continue. "I planned our life with Quentin. We would both work, I could continue my education, become a registered nurse, maybe even a doctor. We would buy a house and my mom could move in with us. She wouldn't have to work 2 jobs anymore. We'd be happy. All 3 of us." Nia grinned bitterly. How naive is that? She picked up one of the pictures, the one of her mother and fiancé kissing on the porch. "I forgot something at the clinic, so I went there on my day off. As I walked up the stairs, I heard my mom laughing from the dressing room. She worked part-time there, folding clean sheets. I wanted to say hello, but stopped when I heard Quentin's voice. He'd never come to her work before. They hadn't seen me. I overheard them talking." Nia paused. "They were talking about how to make a life for themselves after Quentin broke up with me, how they should let me know about their relationship. Quentin said he loved her, that he'd never met a woman like her." Mom laughed. She was happy. "So you followed them, taking those pictures?" Nia nodded. "I wanted to be sure, to gather evidence, to understand how long this had been going on." She shook her head. "For a whole month I pretended I didn't know anything, smiling at Quentin, talking to my mom about wedding plans. And inside, I was dead inside." "What happened that night, Nia?" Mason asked me gently. "I stopped by her place after work. I brought her favorite wine. We drank, talked about the wedding. She was so, hypocritical. Said what a good husband Quentin would make, how happy she was for me." Nia clenched her fists. "I put sleeping pills in her wine. When it worked, I made her swallow the rest of the pills. Then I left a note. I practiced my handwriting for 2 weeks. I wanted it to look like a suicide out of guilt." "Did Quentin know about your plan?" Nia raised her head, fury flaring in her eyes. "Quentin? No. He didn't even know I knew about them. He still doesn't." She grinned again. "He'd been so careful to play the part of the mourner at the funeral. Maybe some of his grief was real, but I could see his relief. Now he won't have to choose between us. He wouldn't have to break my heart. But you'd still break up if the truth came out, Mason pointed out. Yes, but it would have been my choice. I would have left him, despising them both. And now, Nia didn't finish the sentence. Are you planning to plead guilty? Mason asked. Nia stared at the pictures for a long time. Yes, she said finally. I killed my mother. I took away her chance at the happiness she deserved after all the years she'd devoted to me. Her voice shook. But in that moment, all I saw was her betrayal. The way they both betrayed me. Mason looked at the young woman in front of him and felt a strange mixture of sympathy and disgust. Nia Gaines was not insane or impulsive. She had planned her mother's murder in cold blood, prepared methodically for it, and executed the plan with frightening precision. And yet, in her eyes, he saw real pain. The officer will process your confession, he said, standing up. You will be provided with an attorney. Nia nodded but stopped him as he headed for the door. Detective? Mason turned around. Yes? Quentin doesn't know that I saw them together, that I knew about their relationship. He thinks Mom killed herself out of guilt. She paused. Please don't tell him. Let him live with it. Mason looked at her for a long moment. It's not my decision, Miss Gaines. The truth has a way of coming out. 6 months later, Nia Gaines was convicted of second-degree murder. Given her clean confession and no prior convictions, the court sentenced her to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Quentin Brooks attended every session of the trial, his face a mask of grief and disbelief. He never once looked directly at Nia, not even when she testified about how she discovered his relationship with her mother. As the judge read the sentence, Quentin covered his face with his hands and wept silently. Kenyatta Dumont quit her job at the motel and moved out of Lebanon. Too many memories, she told neighbors as she packed up her belongings. The Chanel Gaines house was sold to a new family that had no idea of the tragedy that played out within its walls. Eldridge Mason sometimes drove past that house on his way home, thinking about the woman who wanted a little happiness for herself after years of sacrifice, and the daughter who couldn't accept it. About how easily love can turn into hate, and how even the closest people are sometimes a mystery to each other. In her last conversation with Mason before going to prison, Nia said, "You know what the worst part is? I still love her. I always will." The detective often thought of those words as he pondered the complex nature of human relationships and how thin the line between love and betrayal, between loyalty and obsession. Case closed, he wrote in his final report. But deep down, Mason knew that for those involved in this tragedy, true closure may never come.